Hi class, today we're here to talk about chapter 9, which is related to language and language development. So let's go ahead and get started. When we think about language, we first need to define what language is. And language is going to be a form of communication. This communication can be either written, spoken, signed, or based on symbols. What is really important to understand about language is that it contains what we call infinite generativity, meaning that we have a small number or a finite number of words or rules that we use. And from that, we can create an endless number of meaningful sentences and phrases that we all can understand. So, for example, in English, our alphabet is composed of 26 letters. From those letters, we are able to make really complicated sentences. And we've got infinite number of ways that we can combine those letters together to create meaning that's entirely different from another sentence. And so when we think about language, here could be other examples of language. So we have letters, but language can also include signs. It can include symbols. And all of these things equally convey to us language. Language itself is highly ordered and organized. And the organization involves 5 systems of rules: phonology, morphology, syntax, semantics, and pragmatics. While I'm not going to be going into each of these in great detail with you during our mini lecture, I would highly encourage you to go to your book and make sure that you read about each of these rule systems in greater detail. Our rule systems are important to us, and they do help us to speak language or speak in the way that we're very familiar with today. So how I'm communicating with you is a direct result of how I was able to combine the rule system of language together. But even before we are able to speak, even before we are talking with others, we are being communicated with. And one of the ways that we do that is through infant-directed speech. You may have also heard of motherese or fatherese, parentese, but basically it's this sing-songy pattern in our voice of how we communicate with children. So for example, if we're talking to an infant, we don't say something like, "Hey baby, how are you doing?" Instead, we probably use more of this infant-directed speech, which sounds like, "Hi, little baby, how are you doing?" So you can note that sort of up and down, that sing-songy quality of that speech. This is really important. So it's not only kind of this up and down talk, but we also repeat things heavily within this type of speech. "How are you doing? Are you doing okay? I bet you're doing okay. Look at that smile. You're doing so great today," right? So with that, I'm actually conveying a lot of information. We actually find that deaf mothers, when they sign language in very similar ways to how I just spoke to you now. So you get this kind of up and down pattern, and also a lot of these features where you're repeating portions of that language over and over again. We call this sort of this redundancy feature. We also come up with words that are a little bit shortened. For example, we say mama or dada, right? As opposed to saying mother and father. Instead of saying, "Oh, you received a scratch on your arm," we say, "Did you get a boo-boo?" or "Did you get an ouchie?" Right? So these are kind of shortened ways for us to describe parts of this language speech. So why do people use this type of speech? It actually tends to draw children in. It keeps children's attention. And it also, through that up and down intonation in our voice, allows us to tell children, these are aspects that should be focused on in what I'm trying to tell you. And so this actually becomes an important part of really helping facilitate really, really great speech. So within language development, there is a couple of other things that we do. One is turn taking. So even when we are speaking with a child and we're engaging in that turn taking, we make pauses for kids so that they know when we're inviting them to be able to have part in that conversation. We never actually tell children explicitly that when they're talking that they should talk and stop and pause and allow someone else to talk in order for them to have a conversation. Instead, we do things like, "Hi, how are you doing today?" And then we pause and we wait. Of course, babies can't speak back, so then we'll say, "Are you doing okay?" Pause. Again, we're waiting for that child to respond. This matches that adult type of speech that we typically have, right? That you're talking, you stop, and you allow someone else to talk. At least if you want to have a conversation, that's what you do. We also engage in gesturing. And so before a child is able to speak, we might say something like, "Hey, look over there. It's a dog. That's a dog, baby. Look, it's a dog," right? And so we're pointing. So we're helping the child orient to what we're talking about. And we're bringing that attention over for the child to look at. And then after that, that child is sort of maintaining that attention. Okay. We also have this dynamic sensitivity. And what that means is parents are pretty good at seeing where their children are in terms of their understanding, their level of spoken speech, and they, or just language, and they adjust based on this. So parents are increasing or decreasing, the complexity in which that they are talking and they're speaking based on what would be appropriate for that child. But before we even engage in language, there's going to be that period before children even utter that first meaningful word. And that's going to, happen around 10 to maybe 13 months. We are also have sound perception. So this is going to be our ability to discriminate speech from non-speech, right? So we understand what is actual kind of language versus what is not. So my son does a lot of, babbling. He knows a couple of words that he can say. And sometimes, as a joke, we might say, blah, 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 blah. And he knows that that's not real. And he kind of looks at us because he understands that there's some aspects of what we just did that doesn't really use those very typical speech patterns that we might be accustomed to. Intonational cues are really a very important aspect of learning to understand speech. So this is that vocalization, right? So we don't tend to talk flat. We actually tend to have kind of intonation in how we speak. In fact, if you were to ever, listen to a speech or a lecture or something by somebody who's kind of flat and doesn't really have up and downs in their voice, we tend to find that really boring, right? And so we actually have a preference in general for individuals and kind of have these intonations. Kids actually begin to sort of match this, even if they're not able to speak in spoken language, they still are kind of matching that. In infancy, we've kind of got a general trajectory that we're learning. So first, we're engaging in communication through crying, right? This is evident even in birth. We have different types of cries. I'm going to talk to you about that in just a second. And then at about 1 to 2 months, we coo. And then around 6 months, we engage in babbling, gesturing around 8 to 12 months. And then, we'll see more of that spoken language that we're accustomed to. When we cry, we actually have different types of cries. We've got our basic cry. This is, that just very consistent kind of cry. It's actually pretty rhythmic. In general, there'll be kind of a cry. There might be a little bit of a silence. You might hear a little bit of a inhale, and then maybe a rest, and then a cry again. That anger cry is similar to the basic cry, but you feel a lot more. You can hear a lot more air that's being forced out of those vocal cords. You can tell when a baby is angry. And both of these are very different from our pain cry, which actually kind of has this sort of a long initial cry followed by this kind of holding of the breath before you hear a cry again. In terms of being able to produce certain sounds, we have different parts of our body or our mouth that's able to produce specific sounds. And so, for example, when you have a word that starts with a P, that p sound comes from our lips versus our T, which is more kind of where our teeth are, that kind of front part of our mouth. K, you can feel your tongue up at the roof of your mouth. Each of these are generally more or less complicated. So this is why you might have kids who are able to say some sounds like mama and dada, right? Maybe a little easier than some other sounds that are just a little bit more complicated. And so, what ends up happening is children actually might have understanding of language even before they're able to speak it. And so we might actually be able to get, for example, sign language. If you use sign language with your children, they are able to communicate and do so with far less frustration, even before they're able to verbalize what they're trying to say, right? So we actually we have that language capacity that shows up far before spoken language. In terms of our learning and our literacy, our family environment is really, really important. And so, thinking about environments and the environments children are surrounded by is going to influence that literacy for children. So thinking about number of books that might be available to a child, education level of parents. They've done a study looking at mother's educational level, and they found that mother's educational level is positively correlated to the number of books in the home. So, providing that rich learning environment also helps aids children in that literacy. So we can kind of take a look at this in terms of kind of a graph. This is the age of the child. And this is kind of the amount of kind of utterances or kind of speech patterns that children have. And you can see here that there's a significant difference between children who have parents who may come from these professional backgrounds. And it makes a really, really big difference, probably because of the material that's available to children, that exposure that might be happening as well. And so, again, we really want to stress that it's not necessarily if you're a part of a specific socioeconomic status that's going to cause you to have more or less vocabulary words or ability to speak or have that repertoire of spoken language. What it tends to mean is access, right? And so even if an individual is in a low SES bracket, maybe they're not able to afford to buy all of these books, but going to a public library might be a really great alternative, right? So the idea is just making sure and ensuring that children have access access to these types of things can really profoundly impact that vocabulary, impact that literacy, etc. When we get into middle and late childhood, now we're going to start that kind of reading and writing, that grammar. We start to help children with that writing and actually writing out letters and putting letters together in sentences. By adolescence, we understand that this is happening. We understand how to put letters together, and we're actually far more sophisticated in this. We also are able to understand things like metaphors or satire. And so our writing becomes increasingly more complicated and interesting to read about. By the time we get into adulthood, we actually have very personal ways of speaking. You've got kind of personal linguistic styles. Saturday Night Live does, I think, some really great bits of, they typically do it with different presidents, right? And oftentimes the mannerisms that they are kind of showing are also related to the ways in which one speaks, right? So this is kind of our personal style, how we pause, maybe gestures or things that we use when we're communicating things. This very much is kind of who we are at this point. It's really hard, I imagine, to change. And so you may really like how somebody speaks, or you may find the way they speak like nails on a chalkboard and you just can't stand it. But this style is very sort of indicative of who we are. And you might even actually hear some of these styles and people to pinpoint famous people that they belong to. All right, so this kind of gives us a really nice, I think, snapshot of our Chapter 9, this language development chapter. As always, please note that I'm very happy to answer any questions at all that you have. And feel free to get in touch with me, office hours, class sessions, whatever that time period may be. I'm always here to help answer those questions for you. Really interesting chapter, and I hope that you enjoy the material as you're going through it. Have a wonderful rest of your day. I'll see you soon. Bye.